Let me go ahead and ask Ron. I think he was set to turn off the lights. Yeah, you know what? One of these banks of lights are off already, so it's not going to be exactly as I thought it was going to be. We have to go back here to get it since the front lights are on. This is the only way you can access them. Yeah, I thought so. There, we're all set. Okay, well, this evening we're going to be looking at the life of Jeremiah Burroughs, as I've mentioned, and something of, at least of his preaching. A little bit different than Richard Sibbes, but a great deal in common. The Scripture reminds us that we are to contend earnestly for the faith once for all delivered to the saints, as Jude tells us in Jude verses 1 through 3. As well as diligently guard the bond of unity in the spirit of love. Jeremiah Burroughs was one of those rare individuals who was able to do both. Richard Baxter, who is the first gentleman up here, once wrote that if all Episcopalians had been like Archbishop Usher, and all the Presbyterians like Stephen Marshall — we don't have a picture of him, that's one of the problems with doing a study in an era like this. Not all of the Puritans had their portraits taken, and if all of them did, some of them didn't survive. But if all the Episcopalians had been like Archbishop Usher, all the Presbyterians like Stephen Marshall, and all the Independents like Jeremiah Burroughs, then the divisions of the church would soon have been healed. Burroughs' own heart was so broken by the divisions among the Puritan reformers in the 1640s that it contributed to his premature death, humanly speaking, because no one really dies outside of the Lord's will, at the age of 47. It's amazing to think many of these Puritans didn't live very long, but their writings reflect such a maturity, spiritual maturity, and a great understanding. One of the reasons was, of course, the time frame in which they lived, where, as we saw last week, a person might expect to live only about 30 years if they survive infancy, and half of the children born did not. So if you did, you had to get going, and typically you were in college at 13 or 14, and graduating 4 years later and going into the work you're going to do. You have, about 13 years before you're expecting to die. Some of them, of course, lived quite a bit longer than that, but that was the average life expectancy. He was born in East Anglia, which is an area in the east of England. I tried to find a map that had this in respect to the rest of it, but here's the greater London area right here. This is, what is that? The Atlantic Ocean part of what's it called? English Channel, okay. So we're on the eastern side of England here. And he was educated at Emmanuel College, Cambridge. I need to take another geography lesson, don't I? Now, Emmanuel was founded in 1584 on the site of an old Dominican college and became the greatest seminary of Puritan preachers. Through its doors passed Thomas Hooker, John Cotton, Thomas Shepard, all of whom were founding fathers in New England, as well as Stephen Marshall, William Bridge, Anthony Burgess, Thomas Brooks, and Thomas Watson. And again, we don't have all of them, but this is Hooker, this is Cotton. I believe that this is Shepard. This is the only picture I could find of him. This is William Bridge and Thomas Watson. We're going to look at Watson not next week, but the week following. While he was still at Cambridge, Burroughs became a nonconformist and was eventually forced to leave the university. Now, his ministry falls into three periods upon his, if he was forced to leave the university. We don't know whether he actually earned his degree or not, but we'll assume that he received whatever education he needed. During his first period after leaving Cambridge, he ministered to two congregations in East Anglia, a region where Puritan principles had the greatest influence. His first charge was at Bury St. Edmunds, where he ministered with Edmund Calamy, who was also later to be a famous city preacher. And by the way, you can see there's a likeness of Calamy. He also became a writer. He was one of the co-authors of a particular tract against episcopal government and the liturgy of the Church of England, and also a church leader. Apparently, he was offered at one time, after the restoration of Charles II, a bishopric, which he refused. I imagine on the basis of the fact he didn't agree with taking orders and using the Book of Church or the Book of Prayer. His second charge was as rector of Habitual in Norfolk in 1631. Although East Anglia was a Puritan stronghold, his position was soon jeopardized by the bishops who were determined to enforce nationwide conformity under the direction of William Laud. We saw something of him the last couple of years. That's Laud of their Archbishop, I believe, of Canterbury, and he was the one that brought about the persecution of the Puritans. Bishop Wren, gentleman here, of Norwich, was one of the most adamant members of the Episcopal bench. Through his visitation articles, he insisted on placing the communion table altar-wise. And what that means is, you'll notice that when we're serving the Lord's table, that we put the table out a little ways so that the minister can stand behind it and face the congregation. If it's altar-wise, it's actually placed back further, and the minister stands in front of it and then turns towards it as though it's an altar. And the Puritans considered that to be, to look more like the Roman Catholic Church, which is reflecting more of a Jewish priesthood kind of a mentality, rather than realizing that Christ has performed the once-for-all sacrifice for us. So he insisted on placing the communion table altar-wise, encouraged superstitious gestures not allowed by the prayer book, prohibited afternoon sermons on the Lord's Day, and required all ministers to read the book of sports that urged the people to engage in various recreations on the Lord's Day after the morning service. This particular picture here is, it says, keeping Sunday according to King James Book of Sports. So instead of having a day of rest, it looks like a fair, a day of activities. There's somebody riding a horse and various other things going on. Instead of worshiping, they're basically engaging in worldly recreations. That's something that the Puritans believed was a sin to do on the Lord's Day. We are to rest on the Lord's Day. We are to worship. We're not to engage in worldly recreations, worldly activities in our normal secular work. James wanted he wanted the book of sports enforced on the churches because he wanted those in his kingdom to be fit. He wanted them to engage in sports so that they would become stronger, so that if he had to raise an army, they would already have the physical strength that they needed. In other words, he wasn't thinking so much about their souls as he was the well-being of his kingdom. Several ministers were suspended by Wren for nonconformity or refusing to read the book of sports, among them being Calamy, Bridge, and Burroughs in 1636. The second period of his ministry begins in 1637 when he was called to serve the English church at Rotterdam, which is in Holland, where he stayed for 4 years. And it's interesting, these buildings, although I'm sure they've had some work done on them, still stand to this day. I believe this is called the Pilgrim's Church. Laud's policies not only caused Puritan ministers to leave England, but also many of its citizens. And church members left seeking freedom to worship God according to the Scripture and their conscience. Some crossed the Atlantic to found New England, but others sought refuge on the continent, as the Reformers had done a century earlier. In the 1630s, Holland, which was now free from the yoke of Roman Catholic Spain, especially welcomed the exiles. There was a succession of notable Puritan divines who ministered to the English congregations that were there. And by the way, that church, as I just showed you, was the building which they used, including Dr. William Ames, formerly professor of theology at the University of Franeker. I tried to find a picture of the university, and here is a drawing of it. The reason why there's no pictures that survive is because the university didn't survive until the advent of cameras. Apparently, Napoleon was the one who was responsible for basically destroying it, taking it apart, disbanding it, and so forth. After William Ames had become the teacher of the English church at Rotterdam in 1632, he died the next year. In 1637, Burroughs agreed to fill that office. William Bridge joined him as the pastor of that church after he was forced to leave his charge at Norwich because of Bishop Wren. And I don't know if you've noticed what I've said here. Burroughs was the one who fills the office of teacher. William Bridge was the one who was the pastor. They believed that those were two separate offices. I believe that distinction continues today, even in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. The teachers would sometimes be in congregations if they're large enough to be able to afford one or to support two men, the pastor and the teacher. There would be the pastor first and the teacher if they could afford it. Otherwise, they would teach in colleges or in seminaries. In this case, Burroughs fills the role of the teacher and Bridge that of the pastor. The third period of his life that ends with his death was the period of his greatest success as a preacher in London and a reformer of the independent persuasion. The Long Parliament, which put an end to many of the bad features of Laud's reign, invited the exiled ministers to return to England, including Burroughs. He returned in 1642 to perform a dual role, both as a city preacher and as one of the authors of the New Religious Settlement, which of course was formulated at Westminster. Here's a picture of the Westminster Assembly. Here's the Westminster Abbey in which they met. It was in this second capacity that he was summoned to take his place as a member of the Westminster Assembly. Burroughs was one of the Puritans who played a full part in the work of the Assembly, even though he was among a small group of independents who were opposed to certain features of church government that was agreed on by the majority of the Assembly. As I understand, there was actually several views present. There was the Episcopal view, there was certainly the Presbyterian view, which was prevalent, especially after the Scottish Presbyterians joined them, and the independent view. These 5 dissenting brethren, and I have only 3 pictures here again because only 3 survive, as the independent leaders were called, included Philip Nye, Jeremiah Burroughs, William Bridge, Sidrock Simpson, and Thomas Goodwin. They were in full doctrinal agreement with the other Puritans, and Burroughs especially lamented the deep division that followed. So again, I think this is the only one we haven't mentioned this evening. That's Thomas Goodwin. One of his most famous works, that is Burroughs' work, was Irenicum, or Heart Divisions Opened, in which he pled for the unity of all who love the truth and argued that it was a wrong spirit and wrong motives that turned comparatively minor differences into rigid divisions. That's something, of course, that continues to this day. His efforts to obtain a united church settlement proved to be unsuccessful, though there were many Puritan ministers who were sympathetic, and I think by that is meant united. They were in agreement doctrinally on every matter but that of church government. The whole purpose of the Westminster Confession was meant to unite the 3 kingdoms in a common belief, but there was that feature of church government that they couldn't agree on, so it did leave a measure of division among them, which is what he lamented. During this time of Parliament's power, many of the best preachers came to London, and Burroughs was chosen to preach at Stepney and Cripplegate, the 2 greatest congregations in England. I don't know if you've noticed the similarity of architecture on these buildings. It'd be interesting to find out the origin of these things, but they all seem to have this rather large tower. I imagine it's some sort of a bell tower. At any rate, Burroughs, even though he was an independent and even though he wasn't among the majority, was chosen to pastor these 2 churches that were the largest and most influential, 2 of the greatest congregations in England. It's interesting that at Cripplegate, and the building survives to this day, that's where the Puritans would often get together and they would preach to one another, and they would encourage one another and exhort one another, and those sermons have been preserved to this day in the Cripplegate sermons, which are actually a large, I think it's about 5 or 6 volumes, very fat, with a number of sermons from, it's like a who's who of Puritanism. So they did still quite a bit together, even though there were certain things they couldn't do. At Stepney, he shared the ministry with William Greenhill, who was famous for his commentary on Ezekiel. Burroughs took the earlier service at 7 in the morning, while Greenhill the later service, so that Burroughs came to be called the Morning Star of Stepney and Greenhill the Evening Star. His constant labors and his grief over the divisions in the church contributed to his decline in health, And on November the 14th, 1646, he died of consumption, which I understand in those days was just simply of a wasting disease. It could have been caused by a number of things. If they didn't know what it was, they called it consumption. We learn about what Burroughs' preaching was like through his published works, which were mainly sermons. These sermons were published posthumously for the most part and were very popular during the 17th century. The rare jewel of Christian Contentment was first published in 1648, 2 years after his death. It was prefaced and sponsored by several eminent divines, including, not surprisingly, Bridge, Greenhill, Thomas Goodwin, Philip Nye, and Sidrock Simpson. They conclude their preface of the book by writing this: "The only seat this jewel of contentment is ordained for is the precious tablets of men's hearts, in and from which alone the native luster of it will be made conspicuous. Reader, buy it, set and wear it, and it shall, as Solomon speaks, be life unto your soul and grace unto your neck. You shall not be afraid when you lie down. Yes, your sleep shall be sweet unto you, for the Lord will be your confidence." Basically, that's what Burroughs is seeking to communicate in this book, is the idea that we ought to place our whole hope of happiness upon the Lord, and if it is actually placed upon Him, we can be content in any circumstance. So let's look now at the rare jewel of Christian contentment. And again, what I've done is I haven't just transcribed the whole of the first portion of the book, but have gone through and tried to find those statements by Burroughs that gives to us his points without going into a lot of the illustration and material, although we'll find a great deal of that too. So that Burroughs tells us in his own words exactly what it is he wants to tell us. And in doing this, we are in essence getting a sermon by him. But I don't want you to think that this by any means exhausts the book. It has tremendously more than we could ever possibly absorb in the time frame that we have. It is very full, but I think you're going to find this evening you're going to perhaps hear more than you're going to be able to carry away anyway. But all that he has to say is extremely insightful and very encouraging. So first of all, the text and its explanation. It's based upon Philippians 4:11, as we saw this morning, where Paul writes, "I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am." He goes into a bit of an exegesis of this. We looked at an explanation of it this morning. I'm not going to go through that again, but simply to give you his conclusion of what Paul is actually saying here. What does Paul mean? "I find a sufficiency of satisfaction in my own heart, through the grace of Christ that is in me. Though I have not outward comforts and worldly conveniences to supply my necessities, yet I have a sufficient portion between Christ and my soul abundantly to satisfy me in every condition." This is his paraphrase of what Paul means when he says, "I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am." The doctrinal conclusion that he reaches is this, and if you know anything about Puritan preaching, they typically begin, and they don't take a large portion of Scripture. That's something you'll probably notice, and you'll understand why when you see that on the basis of that one verse, Philippians 4:11, he writes a book that is probably in the Puritan paperback series about 240 pages long. If they were to take a large portion, they wouldn't be able to get through it very soon. As a matter of fact, Joseph Carroll, one of the Puritans, preached through the book of Job. I think it took him something like 30 years to get through it. Now, it's not that he just had a very narrow focus in what he was preaching for those 30 years. He actually covered the whole Bible, but he did it in and through the book of Job. So they usually begin with just one phrase of Scripture, one verse of Scripture that gives to us just one point. And as they examine that in its context, they come up with the doctrine, and then it's the doctrine that they begin to expand on in their work. And his doctrine is basically this, that to be well skilled in the mystery of Christian contentment is the duty, glory, and excellence of a Christian. So if it is our duty, then it will be helpful for us to know what contentment is and how we might have it. So he begins with, what is Christian contentment? He says, I offer the following description. Christian contentment is that sweet, inward, quiet, gracious frame of spirit which freely submits to and delights in God's wise and fatherly disposal in every condition. I want you to notice that he does recognize the sovereignty of God in all things. God is absolutely sovereign. He has planned the end from the beginning. Everything that happens to us, every situation we find ourselves in, whether in want, as we saw in Paul, or in plenty and abundance, all of it is a part of God's plan, okay? So how do we find contentment? Well, basically, what is contentment? Contentment is when we freely submit and delight in that which God has brought into our lives, knowing that it is for good. Now he goes on to explain, and again, the explanation is going to become quite lengthy. We're not going to look at everything that he has to say, but at least enough to understand what he sees by Christian contentment. And then, as he describes what he calls the mystery of contentment, how it seems to be, contrary to what the world thinks, he explains at the same time how we might have it. So what is it? First of all, it is the quiet of the heart. It is not only that we do not seek to help ourselves by outward violence, or that we forbear from discontented and murmuring expressions with perverse words and bearing against God and others, but it is the inward submission of the heart. Truly my soul waiteth upon God. Not only must the tongue hold its peace, the soul must be silent. Many may sit silently, refraining from discontented expressions, yet inwardly they are bursting with discontent. Now, what is this quietness of heart not opposed to? In other words, what is not inconsistent with this quietness of heart, or what is consistent with it? That you may understand this better, I would add that this quiet, gracious frame of spirit is not opposed to certain things. First, to a due sense of affliction. God gives his people leave to be sensible of what they suffer. Christ does not say, do not count as a cross what is a cross. He says, take up your cross daily. Secondly, it is not opposed to making in an orderly manner our moan and complaint to God and to our friends. Though a Christian ought to be quiet under God's correcting hand, he may, without any breach of Christian contentment, complain to God. And of course, he means by that, of course, pour out your concern to him. Not, God, why are you doing this to me? But basically reminding the Lord the situation that you're in and asking for his help. You don't have to refrain from that. Thirdly, it is not opposed to all lawful seeking for help in different circumstances, nor to endeavoring simply to be delivered out of present afflictions by the use of lawful means. So basically, we don't have to pretend that our afflictions aren't afflictions. We can't simply we're not called to keep it to ourselves, and we can't cry to God, we can't say anything to him, and we can't talk to others about it at all. And we're not forbidden to try to get ourselves out of these situations. In other words, just grin and bear it, and don't say anything about it. That's not what it means to be content. So what is it to have a quietness of spirit, or actually, what is it opposed to? What is it that we may not do? Well, first, it is opposed to murmuring and repining, which means expressing discontent at the hand of God, as the discontented Israelites often did. If we cannot bear this either in our children or servants, much less can God bear it in us. Secondly, it's opposed to vexing, being angered or distressed and fretting, which is a degree beyond murmuring. I remember the saying of a heathen, a wise man may grieve for, but not be vexed with his afflictions. There is a vast difference between a kindly grieving and a disordered vexation. Thirdly, it is opposed to tumultuousness or noisiness of spirit, when the thoughts run distractingly and work in a confused manner, so that the affections are like the unruly multitude in the Acts, who did not know for what purpose they had come together. The Lord expects you to be silent under his rod, and, as was said in Acts 19:36, You ought to be quiet and to do nothing rashly. Fourthly, it is opposed to an unsettled and unstable spirit, whereby the heart is distracted from the present duty that God requires in our several relationships toward God, ourselves, and others. In other words, we're not to become frantic, as it were, and forget what it is we're supposed to be doing and what our duty is. Fifthly, it is opposed to distracting, heart-consuming cares. A gracious heart so esteems its union with Christ and the work that God sets it about that it will not willingly suffer anything to come in and to choke it or to deaden it. Sometimes we become so consumed with the particular affliction that we're under that we forget that we forget our relationship with the Lord. We forget our union with Him. Sixthly, it is opposed to sinking discouragements. I know a brother who is a minister. Whenever I would use the word "I'm discouraged," he would reprove me for it, because he said there is no reason ever to be discouraged as a Christian, because God is the one who is in control. How can we just be discouraged when we know that God has planned this and that He's going to work it together for good? It is opposed to sinking discouragements. We never consider that God can open the eyes of the blind with clay and spittle. He can work above, beyond, and even contrary to means. God would have us to depend on Him, though we do not see how the thing may be brought about. Otherwise, we do not show a quiet spirit. Though an affliction is on you, do not let your heart sink under it. So far as your heart sinks and you are discouraged under affliction, so much you need to learn this lesson of contentment. A Christian is never to be discouraged. Seventhly, it is opposed to sinful shiftings and shirkings to get relief and help. We see this kind of thing in Saul running to the witch of Endor and offering sacrifice before Samuel came. Nay, good King Jehoshaphat joins himself with Ahaziah, and Asa goes to Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, for help, not relying upon the Lord, though the Lord had delivered the Ethiopian army into his hands, consisting of 1,000,000 or 1,000,000 soldiers. Do you not experience such workings of spirit as this? Oh, if I could only be delivered from this affliction in any way, I would not care. Your hearts are far from being quiet. This sinful shifting is the next thing which is in opposition to the quietness which God requires in a contented spirit. Be content under the hand of God. Don't run looking for deliverance in anyone else. The last thing that quietness of spirit is the opposite of is desperate risings of the heart against God by way of rebellion. The truth is that not only wicked men, but sometimes the very saints of God find the beginnings of this when an affliction remains for a long time and strikes them, as it were, in the master vein. They find in their hearts something of a rising against God. Their thoughts begin to bubble, and their affections begin to move in rebellion against God Himself. Especially in this, the case with those who besides their corruptions have a large measure, especially in this, the case with those who besides their corruptions have a large measure of melancholy. The devil works both upon the corruptions of their hearts and the melancholy disease of their bodies, and though much grace may lie underneath, yet under affliction there may be some risings against God Himself. Now, Christian quietness is opposed to all these things. When affliction comes, whatever it is, you do not murmur. Though you feel it, though you make your cry to God, though you desire to be delivered and seek it by all good means, yet you do not murmur or repine. You do not fret or vex yourself. There is not a tumultuousness of spirit in you, not an instability. There are not distracting fears in your hearts, no sinking discouragements, no unworthy shifts, no risings in rebellion against God in any way. This is quietness of spirit under an affliction. So he showed us what it isn't. Basically, it doesn't mean we can't, count what we're suffering as a cross to endure. We can't come to God. We can't tell others about it. But basically, he's telling us now what quietness of spirit is opposed to, and this is it. We just don't go running frantically about, discouraged and fretful that all these things are going to destroy us. He says it is an inward, quiet, gracious frame of spirit, and that it is a grace that spreads itself through the whole soul. In some there is a partial contentment. It is not the frame of the whole, or of the soul, of the whole soul, It's not the state of the soul, but some part of the soul has some contentment. Spiritual contentment comes from the frame of the soul. The contentment of a man or woman who is rightly content does not come so much from outward arguments or from any outward help as from the disposition of their own hearts. The disposition of their own hearts causes and brings forth this gracious contentment rather than any external thing. Let me explain myself. Someone is disturbed. Suppose it be a child or a man or a woman. If you come and bring some great thing to please them, perhaps it will quiet them and they will be contented. It is the thing you bring that quiets them, not the disposition of their own spirits, not any good temper in their own hearts, but the external thing you bring them. But when a Christian is content in the right way, the quiet comes more from the temper and disposition of his own heart than from any external argument or from the possession of anything in the world. As another example, just following on what he says here, if a baby is crying and you give the baby a rattle and you settle the baby down, it's the rattle that settles the baby down. It's not the disposition of his heart. It's not his heart that did it. Okay, what he's saying is that this inward, quiet, gracious frame of spirit is able to bring about this quietness from the inside. It's not something that has to be brought about by somebody else. Sometimes when we're distraught, somebody brings us a gift. It sort of gets our mind off of the problem, and we settle down a little bit. That is not Christian quietness or contentedness. It is the frame of spirit that shows the habitual character of this grace of contentment. Now, I say that contentment is a quiet frame of spirit, and by that I mean that you should find men and women in a good mood, not only at this or that time, but as the constant tenor and temper of their hearts. A Christian who, in the constant tenor and temper of his heart, can carry himself quietly with constancy, has learned this lesson of contentment. Otherwise, his Christianity is worth nothing. For no one, however furious in his discontent, will not be quiet when he is in a good mood. Anyone can be quiet and happy when they're in a good mood, but it's the Christian who can be content when he's undergoing things that would normally make a person lose their temper. Contentment, as you can see, contentment is really the key to happiness, and we're going to see how he fills that out. Contentment freely submits to and takes pleasure in God's will. The heart is readily brought over, that is, to submit to the Lord. When someone does a thing freely, he does not need a lot of moving to get him to do it. It is freely, that is, it submits, not by constraint, not, as we say, patience by force. Thus many will say that you must be content. This is the hand of God and you cannot help it. Oh, but this is too low an expression for Christians. No, it should be, readily and freely I will be content. It is suitable to my heart to yield to God and to be content. I find it a thing that comes naturally that my soul should be content. Oh, you should answer your friends so who come and tell you that you must be content. No, I am willing to yield to God and I am freely content. That's quite an interesting lesson. It's not that when a Christian is dealing with this that you come to him and you say, this is your duty. The Christian says, oh no, that's too low. Basically, he's saying it's my pleasure to do this. And of course, if it isn't, then Christians do need to come to them and tell them that it is their duty, but he's saying we ought to go beyond that. This freedom in submitting, again, is in opposition to mere stupidity. A man or woman may be contented merely from lack of sense. This is not free any more than a man who is paralyzed in a deadly way and does not feel it when you nip him is patient freely. So it doesn't come out of stupidity. We understand what we're going through. It comes from an act of the will. Contentment will submit to God and take pleasure in His will in every kind of affliction, no matter how long and no matter how it changes. Now those of you who have learned to be content have learned to attain to these various things. I hope that the very opening of these things may so far work on your hearts that you may lay your hands upon your hearts on what has been said. I say that the very telling you what the lesson is may cause you to lay your hands on your hearts and say, Lord, I see there is more to Christian contentment than I thought there was, and I have been far from learning this lesson. Indeed, I have only learned my ABC in this lesson of contentment. I am only in the lower form of Christ's school, if I am in it at all. We shall speak of these things more later, but my particular aim in opening this point is to show what a great mystery there is in Christian contentment, and how many distinct lessons there are to be learned that we may come to attain to this heavenly disposition to which St. Paul attained. Now, if you've followed what Burroughs has said up to this point, I think you'll probably agree with him that we are only in the ABCs, we've only learned our ABCs of contentment. But he goes on to tell us how we may change our perspectives so that we may experience more of this contentment, which is the bottom line, not just to express to us perhaps what we might call perfect contentment. When we see the standard, it convicts all of us because none of us have attained to it. We're all falling short. But how can we get more of it? How can we be more like the Apostle Paul? Well, we're going to see some of the things that we saw in this morning's sermon, although I didn't draw from this material for the sermon, but it certainly interacts with Paul's experience, and especially through affliction. But there's many different things that he's going to bring up, and he does it under the chapter that's entitled The Mystery of Contentment. It's a mystery because it goes cross to what the world believes contentment really is. He says, but you will object, what you speak of is very good, if we could attain to it. But is it possible for anyone to attain to this? There are many things that men do in their callings that if a countryman comes and sees, he thinks it a mighty hard thing and that he should never be able to do it. But that is because he does not understand the art of it. There is a twist of the hand by which you may do it with ease. Now that is the business of this book, to open to you the art and mystery of contentment. There is a great mystery and art in what way a Christian comes to contentment. But what has been already opened to you, by what has been already opened to you, there will appear some mystery and art, as that a man should be content with his affliction, and yet thoroughly sensible of his affliction too. To be thoroughly sensible of an affliction and to endeavor to remove it by all lawful means, and yet to be content. There is a mystery in that. Grace teaches us how to moderate and to order an affliction so that there shall be a sense of it, and yet for all that, contentment under it. And he shows us how that takes place. There is a mystery in contentment. It may be said of one who is contented in a Christian way that he is the most contented man in the world, and yet the most unsatisfied man in the world. These two together must needs be mysterious. You will say, how is that? A man who has learned the art of contentment is the most contented with any low condition that he has in the world, and yet he cannot be satisfied with the enjoyment of all the world. He is contented if he has but a crust, but bread and water, that is, if God disposes of him for the things of the world, to have but bread and water for his present condition, he can be satisfied with God's disposal in that, or God's will in that. Yet if God should give unto him kingdoms and empires, all the world to rule, if he should give it him for his portion, he would not be satisfied with that. Here is the mystery of it. Though his heart is so enlarged that the enjoyment of all the world and 10,000 worlds cannot satisfy him for his portion, yet he has a heart quieted under God's disposal if he gives him but bread and water. To join these two together must needs be a great art and mystery. Though he is contented with God in a little, yet those things that would content other men will not content him. And this is what we saw this morning, that things that are finite, that were like the things in the world, even if you had this world and 1,000 more, will never content you because they're things that they're going to lose their excitement after a period of time. But if you have a little with one who is infinite, with God, that will satisfy you. Now, that's not a mystery to the Christian, but it is a mystery to those who are in the world. How can a Christian be satisfied with so little when I have so much and I'm not happy? Well, the Christian doesn't need a lot to make him happy. He only needs a little. A Christian gains contentment not by way of addition, but subtraction. Not so much by adding to what he would have or to what he has. Not by adding more to his condition, but rather by subtracting from his desires, so as to make his desires and his circumstances even and equal. The way to be rich is not by increasing wealth, but by diminishing our desires. Certainly that man or woman is rich who have their desires satisfied. Now, a contented man has his desires satisfied. God satisfies them. That is, all considered, he is satisfied that his circumstances are for the present the best circumstances. Now, that is interesting, isn't it? Because contentment comes by having what you want. And if your desires are greater than what you have, then you're not content. What he says is, diminish those desires and bring them down to what you have. Okay? Well, what you have is God. And he is the one who satisfies more than anything else. Okay? A contented man has his desires satisfied. God satisfies them. That is, all considered, he is satisfied that his circumstances are for the present the best circumstances, realizing too that what I'm going through at the present time is what God has for me, because he is the one who is sovereign. So that if I have what God has for me, then I have all that I want, in which case I can be content. Okay. A Christian gains contentment not by removing his burden, but by adding a burden. Are you afflicted? And is there a great load and burden on you because of your affliction? You think there is no way in the world to get contentment, but oh, that this burden were but off. Oh, it is a heavy load, and few know what burden I have. Do you think that there is no way for the contentment of your spirit but to get rid of your burden? Oh, you are deceived. The way of contentment is to add another burden. That is to labor, to load, and burden your heart with your sin. The heavier the burden of your sin is to your heart, the lighter will the burden of your afflictions be to your heart, and so you shall come to be content. I don't know if you've ever done that, but in a situation where you are struggling, you need to realize that sometimes our discontentment comes from the fact that we believe that we don't deserve what's happening to us. But as I've been reminded again by the same minister who told me I should never be discouraged, and I'm rebuked when I say that, he'll also remind me, well, what is it exactly that you deserve that you don't think you're getting? Well, what do you deserve, okay? Based upon our own works outside of Christ, what we deserve is hell. And I'm not getting hell. So I ought to be happy with what the Lord is giving to me, because it's much better than what I actually deserve. And when I understand that, when I see what my sins actually deserve, and I think that's what Burroughs is talking about here, then it's not so hard to bear the burden of what it is that God has ordained for me. I'm loading my heart down with that. Now he gives an illustration, and this is a very helpful one, I think. Many times in a family, when any affliction befalls them, oh, what an amount of discontent is there between man and wife. If they are crossed in their possessions at land, or have bad news from across the seas, or if those whom they trusted are ruined and the like, or perhaps something in the family causes strife between man and wife in reference to the children or servants, and there is nothing but quarreling and discontent among them, now they are many times burdened with their own discontent, and perhaps will say to one another, it is very uncomfortable for us to live so discontented as we do. But have you ever tried this way, husband and wife? Have you ever got alone and said, come, oh, let us go and humble our souls before God together. Let us go into our chamber and humble our souls before God for our sin, by which we have abused those mercies that God has taken away from us, and we have provoked God against us. Oh, let us charge ourselves with our sin and be humble before the Lord together. Have you tried such a way as this? Oh, you would find that the cloud would be taken away, and the sun would shine in upon you, and you would have a great deal more contentment than ever you had. If a man's estate is broken, either by plunderers or any other way, how shall this man have contentment? How? by the breaking of his heart. God has broken your estate. Oh, seek to him for the breaking of your heart likewise. Indeed, a broken estate and a whole heart, a hard heart, will not join together. There will be no contentment. But a broken estate and a broken heart will so suit one another as that there will be more contentment than there was before. So realize again that you deserve this. For your sin, you don't deserve better than this. And realize too, as he said earlier, that God means this for your good. Okay, so that's one way to gain contentment. Contentment is gained not so much by removing the affliction as the changing of it into something else. I mean in regard to the use of it, though for the thing itself the affliction remains. The way of contentment to a carnal heart is only the removing of the affliction. Oh, that it may be gone. No, says a gracious heart. God has taught me a way to be content through the affliction itself, or though the affliction itself still continues. There is a power of grace to turn this affliction into good. It takes the sting and the poison of it. Take the case of poverty. A man's possessions are lost. Well, is there no way to be contented till your possessions are made up again? Till your poverty is removed? Yes, certainly. Christianity would teach contentment, though poverty continues. It will teach you how to turn your poverty to spiritual riches. You should be poor still as to your outward possessions, but this shall be altered. Whereas before it was a natural evil to you, it comes now to be turned to a spiritual benefit to you. And so you come to be content. The idea, well, let me just back up to that again. The idea is realizing that this affliction is meant to be good. Some of these are just simply the same thing from a different perspective, but realizing that God has intended this for good, it can turn to be a spiritual benefit. There are lessons to be learned. God is trying to teach me something, and if I learn what that thing is, if I learn what good God is seeking to teach me through this, then I can be content because God is teaching me something that I need to know. Contentment is achieved not by gaining back what is lost, but by doing the duty your circumstances require. This is the way of contentment. There are these circumstances that I am in with many wants. I want this and the other comforts. Well, how shall I come to be satisfied and content? A carnal heart thinks, I must have my wants made up, or else it is impossible that I should be content. But a gracious heart says, what is the duty of the circumstances God has put me into? Indeed, my circumstances have changed. I was not long since in a prosperous state, but God has changed my circumstances. The Lord has called me no more Naomi, but Mara. I think you understand the reference there when Naomi and her husband went to Moab, and there her husband died, and after the two sons took two wives, Moabite women, the two sons died, and then one of her daughters-in-law left, and only Ruth was left. Basically, she came there full, and she left empty. She's no longer Naomi, but now Mara. What am I to do? What can I do? Okay. What can I think now are those duties that God requires of me in the circumstances that He has now put me into? Let me exert my strength to perform the duties of my present circumstances. Others spend their thoughts on things that disturb and disquiet them, and so they grow more and more discontented. So basically in this idea that when something like that happens, I should find out what it is that God wants me to do. Realize that He has something for me to do, a lesson to learn, as we saw before, but also a duty to perform, and to perform that duty and spend my energy on that. That will give me contentment rather than being frantic over what I've lost. Contentment is gained by submitting your desires to God's desires. This too is a mystery to a carnal heart. It is not by having my own desires satisfied, but by melting His will and desires into God's will, so that in one sense He comes to have His desires satisfied, though He does not obtain the thing that He desired before. Still He comes to be satisfied with this because He makes His will to be at one with God's will. Others would fain get the thing they desire, but a gracious heart will say, Oh, what God would have, I would have too. I will not only yield to it, but I would have it too. It is by this that a gracious heart gets contentment. He melts his will into God's, for he says, if God has glory, I have glory. God's glory is my glory, and therefore God's will is mine. If God has riches, then I have riches. If God is magnified, then I am magnified. If God is satisfied, then I am satisfied. God's wisdom and holiness is mine, and therefore his will must needs be mine, and my will must needs be his. This is the art of a Christian's contentment. He melts his will into the will of God and makes over his will to God. If God is content with these circumstances, I can be content with these circumstances. Contentment doesn't come from bringing comforts from without, but by purging our sins from within. Now, the men of the world, when they would have contentment and lack anything, they must have something from outside to content them. But a godly man says, let me get something out of that, let me get something out that is in already, and then I shall come to contentment. Suppose a man has a fever that makes what he drinks taste bitter. He says, you must put some sugar into my drink. His wife puts some in, and still the drink tastes bitter. Why? Because the bitterness comes from a bitter choleric humor within, some sickness within. But let the physician come and give him a bitter portion to purge out the bitterness that is within, and then he can taste his drink well enough. It is just the same with the men of the world. Oh, such a mercy added to this mercy, then it would be sweet. But even if God should put a spoonful or two of sugar in it, it would still be bitter. The way to contentment is to purge out your lusts and bitter humors within. So the idea is that sometimes it's something inside of us that's causing the discontent. It's not something we need from outside, and he's already shown us several of the things that it could be. So we need to put our sins to death, which are causing the discontentment, and then what God gives to us we can receive and be content with. He is content with what little the Lord gives him. Adrian Junius uses the simile of a grasshopper to describe a contented man, and says he has this motto, I am content with what I have and hope for better. A grasshopper leads and skips up and down and lives on the dew. A grasshopper does not live on the grass as other things do. You do not know what it feeds on. I imagine we know something more than they knew in those days. Other things, though, as little as grasshoppers, feed upon seeds or little flies and such things. But as for the grasshopper, you do not know what it feeds upon. In the same way, a Christian can get food that the world does not know of. He is fed in a secret way by the dew of the blessing of God. A poor man or woman who has but a little with grace lives a more contented life than his rich neighbor who has a great income. We find it so ordinarily. Though they have but little, yet they have a secret blessing of God with it, which they cannot express to anyone else. If you were to come to them and say, how is it that you live as happily as you do? They cannot tell you what they have, but they find there is a sweetness in what they do enjoy. And they know by experience that they never had such sweetness in former times. Even though they had a greater abundance in former times than they have now, yet they know they never had such sweetness. But how this comes, they cannot tell. Well, he gives us 5 reasons why. Because in what he has the love of God to him. What they have is sanctified to them for good. A gracious heart has what he has free of cost. He is not likely to be called to pay for it. A godly man may very well be content, though he has only a little. For what he does have, he has by right of Jesus Christ, by the purchase of Jesus Christ. And then, number 5 especially, there is another thing that shows the sweetness that is in the little that the saints have, by which they come to have contentment, whereas others cannot. That is, every little that they have is but as an earnest penny for all the glory that is reserved for them. It is given them by God as the forerunner of those eternal mercies that the Lord intends for them. So having the Lord with little, again, is better than having a lot without him, and realizing that even the little they have is just a foretaste of what God will give them, and that little being, of course, the thing that satisfies them. they are content. He is content with what little the Lord gives him, even in afflictions, and find them very sweet to him. But in all the afflictions, all the evils that befall him, he can see love and can enjoy the sweetness of love in his afflictions as well as in his mercies. The truth is that the afflictions of God's people come from the same eternal love that Jesus Christ came from. Jerome said, "He is a happy man who is beaten when the stroke is a stroke of love." All God's strokes are strokes of love and mercy. All God's ways are mercy and truth to those that fear him and love him. So knowing that these things come from God and from his love, we can be content. A godly man is content as a mystery, because just as he sees all his afflictions come from the same love that Jesus Christ did, so he sees them all sanctified in Jesus Christ, sanctified in a mediator. He sees, I say, all the sting and venom and poison of them taken out by the virtue of Jesus Christ, the mediator between God and man. For instance, when a Christian would have contentment, he works it out thus. What is my affliction? Is it poverty that God strikes me with? Jesus Christ had not a house to hide his head in. The fowls of the air had nests and the foxes holes, but the Son of Man had not a hole to hide his head in. Now, my poverty is sanctified by Christ's poverty. I can see by faith the curse and sting and venom taken out of my poverty by the poverty of Jesus Christ. There is a further mystery. A gracious heart has contentment by getting strength from Jesus Christ. He is able to bear his burden by getting strength from someone else. A Christian finds satisfaction in every circumstance by getting strength from another, by going out of himself to Jesus Christ, by his faith acting upon Christ, and bringing the strength of Jesus Christ into his own soul. He is thereby enabled to bear whatever God lays on him by the strength that he finds from Jesus Christ. Of his fullness do we receive grace for grace. There is strength in Christ not only to sanctify and save us, but strength to support us under all our burdens and afflictions. And Christ expects that when we are under any burden, we should act our faith upon him to draw virtue and strength from him. Faith is the great grace that is to be acted under afflictions. It is true that other graces should be acted, but the grace of faith draws strength from Christ in looking on him who has the fullness of all strength conveyed into the hearts of all believers. This is the way a godly man gets contentment, the mystery of it by getting strength from Jesus Christ. The believer makes up what he lacks in God. That is another mystery. He has God in what he has. I spoke about that somewhat before in showing the due of God's blessing in what one has. For God is able to let out a great deal of his power in little things, and therefore the miracles that God has wrought have been as much in the little things as in great. Now, just as God lets out a great deal of his power in working miracles in smaller things, so he lets out a great deal of goodness and mercy in comforting and rejoicing the hearts of his people in little things as well as in great. There may be as great riches in a pearl as in a great deal of lumber, but this is a different thing. So the Lord can, again, fill us in small things that he gives to us, and we can be content. The believer gains contentment from the covenant God made with him. Now this is a way of getting contentment that the men of the world do not know. They can get contentment if they have the creature or things to satisfy them. But in getting contentment from the covenant of grace, they have little skill. I should have opened two things here. First, how to get contentment from the covenant of grace in general, but I shall speak of that in the next sermon, and now only a word on the second. Secondly, how he gets contentment from the particular branches of the covenant, that is, from the particular promises that he has for supplying every particular want. There is no condition that a godly man or woman can be in, but there is some promise or other in the Scripture to help him in that condition. And that is the way of his contentment, to go to the promises and get from the promise that which may supply. This is but a dry business to a carnal heart, but it is the most real thing in the world to a gracious heart. When he finds lack of contentment, he repairs to the promise and the covenant and falls to pleading the promises that God has made. God has made promises, as he says, in every situation, so in order to find contentment, we simply go to him and plead his promises. He finds contentment because of what God has promised in heaven. He has the kingdom of heaven as present and the glory that is to come. By faith, he makes it present. So the martyrs had contentment in their sufferings. For some of them said, "Though we have but a hard breakfast, yet we shall have a good dinner. We shall very soon be in heaven. Do but shut your eyes," said one, "and you shall be in heaven at once." "We faint not," says the apostle. Why? Because these light afflictions are but for a moment, work for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. They see heaven before them, and that contents them. And then finally, a godly man finds contentment by looking to God. Other men or women are discontented, but how do they help themselves? By abuse, by bad language. Someone crosses them, and they have no way to help themselves but by abuse and by bitter words, and so they relieve themselves in that way when they are angry. But when a godly man is crossed, how does he relieve himself? He is aware of his cross as well as you, but he goes to God in prayer, and there opens his heart to God and lets out his sorrows and fears, and then can come away with a joyful countenance. Do you find that you can come away from prayer and not look sad? It is said of Hannah that when she had been at prayer, her countenance was no more sad. She was comforted. This is the right way to contentment. Now, Burroughs, this again just scratches the book. There's a lot more in there, and I had to wade through actually quite a bit just to excise these particular points. But there's a great deal more. We're going to stop here, obviously, because we don't have time to go through the whole book, and I'm sure we're already operating on overload as it is. So I just want to remind you, though, that these slides and these notes, these extractions from Burroughs' book are going to be posted online. So if you want to refer to those, I think there was a great deal of wisdom contained here. And I believe if we even just focus on the things we've seen, we can easily learn the art of contentment and gain that rare jewel, as it were, as Burroughs calls it. Looks like Jerry's heading to the lights, and that's fine. So, any questions? Any questions or comments? I realize, oh yes, Kathy.
Just out of curiosity, what exactly is the independent view of church government?
Oh, okay. Well, the independent view basically sees that the church is one body, as the Lord tells us it is, but doesn't necessarily see that the church has to function together organizationally as one body. So they would have something in common with Presbyterianism, which is that they would have a local session, and they would have that government, plurality of elders at that level. But they would believe that the government of that church is independent from the government of their neighboring church, or the church over here, and they wouldn't be bound together by presbyteries or by a general assembly. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't see that there is a connection between the churches and an accountability between them, but they would say there is no authority that one can pull over them because the session would be the highest authority. Jonathan Edwards, for instance, was in an independent church, and the people wanted to remove him when he went against Solomon Stoddard's view of the Lord's Supper. So in order to do that, they couldn't just say, "We fire you," although funny thing is, in some Presbyterian churches, it's exactly what they do. But they couldn't do that. Instead, they had to call together a council, and they did that from neighboring independent churches and put the council together and set the matter before them, and then Edwards submitted to their decision. So there is that extra level of accountability if they need it because they're accountable to one another, but there isn't, as it were, and we wouldn't say there's necessarily a higher authority in Presbyterianism, although sometimes it works out that way, and I don't think it should. It's a broader kind of thing rather than a higher kind of thing. But in the independencies, you can see the churches are basically independent. We have a relative degree of independency in Presbyterianism where we are a local church governed by a local body. We are accountable to the other brethren in a more regular way. than you would be in independent churches, in a more direct way than you would be. I hope that helps. Brian?
Pastor, I really don't know. What was the nonconformist movement all about?
Well, nonconformity had to do with not agreeing with the government of the Church of England. They didn't agree with episcopacy, and they didn't see, for instance, the idea of the office of a bishop as being separate from an elder. Presbyterians, which presbyteros means elder, they believe that elder is the highest office there is, and that bishop is, or overseer, is basically the function of the office rather than a separate office. So they didn't want to take episcopal orders. They didn't want to be ordained in the Church of England and submit to that form of government. They also didn't want to be bound to the book of prayer, to set forms of prayer and set forms of worship. They wanted to have the freedom to pray extemporaneously and so forth. I believe that there are also, in the book of prayer, there may also be some sermons and some readings and so forth. They just wanted more liberty than that. So that was, I think, mainly the reason why they didn't submit to that. Greg?
I think the point is that there was a time when they were required by law to be in conformity to all of those things.
Yes.
They adopted a non-conformist position, which is why some of them were in jail for a while.
Right. I think we'll see something of that in Bunyan's life. I think he was in prison for not going to the churches that were Episcopal or Anglican churches. But they were forced to do that. They were required to do that, and they did that. Actually, some of the Puritans that had no problem with the book of prayer, and they didn't have a problem with set forms of prayer, but they wanted the freedom to do what they thought was right, and some to have the freedom to, okay, I'm not going to use the book of prayer today. I'm going to use an extemporaneous prayer, but conformity would require them always to use it. Okay, we didn't give them that liberty. So, any other questions or comments? One thing I should note, and you've probably noticed, was that Burroughs was not quite as easy to understand as Sibbes. But I hope that by its being read, and these were, I think, excerpts that were more understandable than others that might have been read. One thing about the Puritans is some of them are very readable and some of them are difficult. And the ones that are readable are often very good. I mean, you could spend your whole life reading the readable ones and never get to the ones that are difficult to read. Richard Baxter is somebody who was very easy to read. Thomas Watson, for the most part, I think. Let's see, who else would be easy? Richard Sibbes, I suppose. But the excerpts that we had from last week, I think came from a version of his book that may have been modernized somewhat, beyond just changing the funny-looking, the S's that look like F's and so forth. Some other things in the thous and these in the King James type language, perhaps modernized. And actually, it looks like from this, that was taken out of Burroughs' work as well. There may have been a little bit more work done to it, but not a great deal. It wasn't a paraphrase. So some of them are very readable just as they are. Others, like John Owen, are quite difficult. But it's worth your while to read John Owen and to try to struggle through the language because of the depth of his understanding. It's just amazing. The Puritans could not get by with just preaching one sermon on this text. They had to exhaust the text. They had to examine every nook and cranny. They had to fill it out until you had just a very clear picture of what this is and what to do about it. One thing that you'll notice as you look through the years at preaching, you look at Puritan sermons, and then you move on a little bit further from, say, like the 17th century, you move into the 18th century, and they're still fairly technical, but they get a little bit simpler. And then you move into the 19th century, you look at Spurgeon, a lot of those were in the 19th century. Did he die before he got to the 20th century? I forget. Okay, so they're all in the 19th century. But they become simpler, even though by comparison today, they're still very complicated. I've had some say regarding the sermons that I preach that they're very heavy, but yet mine are nothing compared to this. This is heavy as far as doctrinal content. You have to think about what's being said. There isn't just one point and 100 illustrations, and that kind of thing, where it seems like, I don't know, the minister might spend a great deal of time on a simple point you get as soon as it's said, but then you have to hear it illustrated and applied and illustrated and applied until you're saying, okay, I've had enough, let's move on. it may have more substance. But look at what these guys were giving. It was just a tremendous amount of material. And the reason why we don't see this today is probably because it's not popular, for one, and secondly, because there aren't too many men who are equipped to do this. Very, very few. And this, by the way, the book was not one sitting. It wasn't just one sermon preached on one Lord's Day. But it wasn't uncommon for a sermon to last a minimum of 90 minutes. And oftentimes could go as long as 3 hours. A 3-hour sermon. That's a lot of material. So, anyway, any other questions or comments? Donna?
So there's this saying that when you had, the afflictions and afflictions in your life, one of the responses is going to be that you would try to find lawfully accepting relief yourself from that burden, but there isn't a way to commit yourself to prayer, to promises, relying on the Lord, waiting on Him for relief from anything. Obviously, then just, I guess, admitting yourself to the idea that you're going to teach me something or
Right. Well, what he was saying was, yes, that when the Lord lays a burden on me, that I'm not forced to be under that burden if I can find relief in a lawful way. If I can go to Him. He's not saying I can't go to Him and I just have to bear this. I can't go to a brother or sister and ask for help from them to help me bear this. I'm not forced to bear this burden. If there is a way that I can be relieved of it right now, which is a lawful way, then I need to go that way instead of saying that, no, I can't. God has laid this on me and I need to bear it. But when I can't find relief, when there is no way out from under it, then these rules apply to help me be content in these circumstances. And I should be content even when I'm going around looking for help, trying to get out from under. Oh, I can't get out from under this, so I guess I'll just have to be content. Well, we have to be content even when it first comes into our lives. And I think we'd all admit that we are discontent over a number of things. And I mean, we're talking about not just heavy things that happen at certain points in our life. We're talking about things that happen to us every day. I need, for instance, to learn to be content when I come up to the light. It changes just before I get there. Again, this is something that we all have to deal with. And then it lasts an exorbitant length of time. I remember sitting. I think it was yesterday. I just missed this one light. And I'm sitting there, I'll just wait for the cycle, and I'm waiting, and I'm waiting, and I'm waiting. It stays green going this way, and it seemed like for 5 minutes it was green, and it wasn't allowing any of us to go this direction, and I thought, it's because I'm here that this is happening. But I need to learn to be content, and until I can learn to be content, that's going to continue to happen, I'm sure. Yeah, so I haven't learned contentment yet. So I feel like James and John sometimes. I want to call down fire from heaven to devour the light and just move on. But again, I mean, that's really, we do need to learn contentment in all things. If we can learn that lesson, it will take the edge off of anger, and frustration and discouragement and everything that we find ourselves faced with in life. Because what Burroughs is reminding us of here is the fact that whatever is happening to me is God's will. And I need to be content with that this is God's will for me, whatever it may be. Again, I'm reminded of what James Montgomery Boyce said when he had cancer and it spread to his liver. He said, I'm content with this. If I could change things, if I could make it any other way, he said that he would not do that. And that's really what the Christian should say, because he said, if I changed it, if I made myself well, or if I could have God make me well and that changed His plan, then that would not be as good for me as where I am now, because this is what God has done and this is what's good for me. Now, doesn't mean, of course, that God, afflicted him just directly with cancer and so forth, but in His plan, in the way that He made Boyce and the things that he was exposed to in his life and so forth, that this would arise. That was His will. And and that God would work it together for good. So it was good that Boyce was removed from the world when he was, and we'll see the good that comes out of it. It was good for Boyce, certainly. I mean, he's with the Lord, and nothing could be better than that. So whatever comes into our life, we need to realize that it does come from the Lord, and we need to be content with that, and that includes everything that happens to us. The good situations, as Paul says, I've learned to live with abundance, and the bad situations, I've learned to be content in want, or when I'm hungry and so forth, or when I'm abused, or when people are not treating me well, or when I'm persecuted, or when I'm afflicted. And we went through that whole catalog of what Paul went through. All the times he was stoned once, how many times he was beaten, how many times he was in the deep and shipwrecked, and all the things that he went through, in danger from this and that, and then, of course, the constant care of the churches. And in all of that, he was content in any circumstance because he knew this is what the Lord had for him. So that's the lesson that Burroughs is not only trying to tell us that, here's contentment, here's how you can have it, but he's saying this is your duty. We saw that at the very beginning. This is not a suggestion from the Lord. This is what he wants you to learn in these circumstances. This is what he wants me to learn. And we do need to look at every situation that happens to cross our wills as an opportunity to learn contentment, because that's what the Lord is seeking to teach us, so that we control ourselves. And the one thing he said here about taking it to the Lord. A godly man finds contentment by looking to God when you're faced with these things. Look to God and pour out your heart to him, and come away, as he says, Hannah came away when she had prayed, no longer sad, or no longer frustrated, or no longer discouraged, or no longer angry, or whatever it is our discontent might be generating in our lives. It always generates something that is sinful. And so we need to learn contentment. You can see, if you can put this on, it's going to change your life. No longer be frustrated, no longer have those things. They'll still be there. And you'll recognize them as what they are, but you'll see them in a different light, basically, is what Burroughs is trying to help us do here. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Dick?
Burroughs covered everything about being content when you find yourself in circumstances brought on by one's sin.
I didn't see it in this material, but I wouldn't doubt that he covers that. One thing, if we maybe can go outside of Burroughs here for a little bit, we do need to realize that the Lord has ordained even our sins. And he has ordained our sins for our good, if we are believers, because he works all things together for our good, and all things would include even our sins. So that Edwards on one occasion said that it was good that, or at least the Lord worked good. We can't say the situation in and of itself is good, but the Lord worked good out of the situation that David fell into when he committed murder and adultery and so forth. Now, he would go on to say that it would be better if David hadn't gone through that, if he hadn't fallen into that, but even though he did, the Lord worked good out of it. And sometimes, Edwards say, you even can benefit more having fallen into it than not having fallen into it. That it could be God's plan that this will actually work out better than if you had not fallen into it to begin with, because, again, God works all things together for good. But either way, whether greater if you hadn't fallen into it and just good works out of it, or greater good because you actually had to go through this, good comes out of it either way. So I think Burroughs, we take what Burroughs is saying here, then we would look to that promise. So I guess you might say he does address that, because this is looking to the covenant of grace, as he says, and looking at the promises that the Lord has made. And there is a promise for the person in that situation, if, of course, he repents from that sin. If he falls into it and continues in it, then there are other things attached to that. But the fact that he has repented and that the Lord works all things together for good, he can look to that and he can be content instead of continuing to beat himself like Luther did before his conversion over his sins with a whip on his back and that type of thing, trying to punish himself for these things, to realize that Christ has already been punished for them. I'm sufficiently, or at least by God's grace, I have some measure of humility and humbling and repentance of this sin, and I can look to God's promise that he's going to work good out of it. Are there any other questions or comments? Brian?
I just want to thank you
Well, it's my pleasure to do this. I really enjoy this, and I hope you don't mind hearing it from the horse's mouth. It's really hard to take things in this language and condense it. I try to with the headings and so forth, but you really lose something in the translation when you try to paraphrase this kind of material. They had the how would we say, the right to use a vocabulary that we can't use anymore, and it does have a certain grandeur about it. I mean, we can take these lofty truths that are expressed in these majestic words and we can simplify it. It almost seems to degrade the truth, though. It seems to bring it down to, it doesn't have the impact that it had before. I think we lose something when we sort of squeeze those words down to our common vocabulary now. Although we have to recognize, on the other hand, if we don't understand the words they're using, it's not going to have much of an impact on us. And we do need simple words for it to register, right?
One of the slides that you had up there, it struck me how absolutely contrary to much of what is advanced in the way of Christian counseling this whole concept of Christian contentment is, because the counselors start from a position that I'm unhappy because I haven't got what I want, and then they try and train you to think the right way about how to get what you need or what you want. And that's a very different premise than the one that Burroughs provided with that.
I suppose it would be at least a major element missing at the outset. I mean, if it is something, let's say it is an affliction, they need to learn to be content in that before they move on to find the way out. So it seems like we do move on to finding the way out before telling them they need to first be content with this because it is God's will. That's a good point. Yes, Josh?
It was encouraging to hear about his desire for unity amongst the Protestants. And I was just wondering if you could comment on what you think that would look like today. I mean, it does seem, especially unfortunately, and perhaps for reform circles, that we do tend to major on many things that perhaps would be considered minors to the point of division. I think of certain people that have sought more unity. I know John Crane has sought to do that a lot, but even somebody like John Crane, people would look at him and say, well, he's compromising too much, and so on and so forth. And then there's the other extreme of the ecumenical movements that just want to, check the grain at the door and just, I don't know, strum guitars and stuff.
What?
But,
Hopefully we don't want just strum guitars.
But what, I mean, I guess my question is, what, twofold, what would that look like today? And is there maybe a group or some men that are seeking to do that in a healthy way that you could use as an illustration?
You know, the only movements that I'm aware of, I mean, besides the ones that are, like you say, radical, like the ecumenical movement, the worldwide, churches, or what they call the Worldwide Council of Churches, where basically they're going to, let's put up the bare bones. What do we have to agree on here? The universal fatherhood of God and universal brotherhood of man. If we agree on that, then let's join ranks and so forth. We would need to have, I think, that without which we can't have unity, and certainly have to be around the fundamentals. Those are primary. Then the question would be, are there any secondary kinds of things? The only movements I'm aware of that have actually been attempting this, I don't know if you know that the OPC, for instance, has a council or a committee on ecumenicity, and their purpose is to seek union with other like-minded believers. But what they do, of course, is they go to the churches that are almost like this one, and they don't go outside of that field. So they would operate within the bounds of the confession and say that's the boundary of our unity. As a matter of fact, the Westminster Confession, that was the reason why Burroughs was so disheartened, or he wasn't discouraged, of course, but brokenhearted. I suppose you could use that terminology, because the churches could not agree, and there were articles within it that would exclude some that ought to be included. And you can see the difficulty that would exist there with, okay, how are we going to unify the Episcopal government and the independent government and the Presbyterian government when they're so opposed to one another. Well, I guess what he would say is, let's just leave those articles out, and you can have your government, we'll have our government, and so forth. Let's still recognize our unity, and let's move on from there. Don't exclude us because you put this article into your confession, kind of thing. So like I said, the Council on Ecumenicity might be looking at the Bible Presbyterian Church, might be looking at the Reformed Church in the United States, might in some degree be looking at the United Reformed Church and so forth, but they're not looking at the Reformed Baptist Church because of the difference on baptism. Now, I have heard of churches where those who have various opinions that get together and they all function together, and apparently they're able to do that, which is good. Where you might have a dispensationalist and a covenant theologian, an Arminian and a Calvinist, a Paedo-Baptist and a Baptist, and they're all working together, and it can be done. Now, John Frame's case, I think he came under criticism because he was saying, let's not work out the differences from the outside. Let's just all put everybody into one pot and work our differences out on the inside. So let's have organic unity to begin with. Let's just all unite. And then let's all get together and hammer out our differences. And those from the who were looking at that were saying, well, what would that look like? That would we'd spend probably decades trying to iron these things out, and may not be able to get a whole lot done in the meantime. So they didn't think that was a great idea. But John was going from a principle, which is, hey, we ought to be one church, and let's if we're all put together, we'll be forced to work it out, kind of thing. And I do think that oftentimes, in even though different Christians may hold different positions, it depends on where you go with those things and how hard you press those things as to whether you can get along with someone else or not. And obviously there were those, as you said, Stephen Marshall as a Presbyterian, James Ussher as an Episcopal or an Anglican, who could get along with Burroughs, who all desired unity rather than making their differences as wedges to drive them apart and a point of contention every time they get together. So I do believe that really there's much more unity that we could have than we do have. But because some are really pushing these differences, it does keep us apart. Yes, Josh?
From what you read, did you get the impression that he would draw the line with that fellowship with Arminian-minded folk?
I don't know. I don't know where he draws a line on that particular issue. I do know that Richard Baxter was of a broad heart and mind, and he actually tried to come up with a position that both the Calvinist and the Arminian could agree on, with the basically adopting a view by Amyraldianism, which compromised both views, and actually neither of them liked him or his view. But his purpose behind it was to try to bring them together. But he was trying to resolve the issue between them by doing that. But I think his attitude was right, because it was distressing to him that these brethren were divided. At least he recognized them as brethren and didn't say, well, you're an Arminian, so you're not in the church, kind of thing, and I'm not going to fool with you. So, more can be done. Greg?
I think in practice there's a sliding scale, because whilst you could recognize an Arminian as a brother and you could have fellowship with him in the Lord, it could be difficult in practice to evangelize with them, because they would come from a position that would make your hair stand on them effectively.
I suppose they could, couldn't they? And on the other hand, it's possible that if they just stuck with the biblical message and their conception of how it works, versus your conception of how it works, and you stick to the biblical message, you can both preach the same message. The question is whether or not they're going to do that, or add their explanations into it, which ends up destroying its content. By the way, I was going to mention, too, that John Owen, who was an independent, and he's Paedo-Baptist, and one of the greatest theologians who's ever lived, when John Bunyan was in prison, had very good things to say about Bunyan, not because he was in prison, but which would be a very negative thing, but he did everything he could to try to get Bunyan out of prison, because he believed that the Lord had given him such a gift to communicate the gospel. Now, they differed, as far as I know, only on the issue of baptism, but Owen didn't say, oh, he's a Baptist, he should stay in prison kind of thing. He said, I mean, that wasn't his attitude. I need to help my brother get out of prison so he can preach the gospel. And I think we need to see more of that kind of thing. And he also, John Owen was a very humble man, even though he had such a gift given him by the Lord of just a breadth of understanding. If you read his writings, you can just see, I mean, he could see so much. We look at a text and we see so little, and he looks at a text and he sees so much. And he not only, of course, tried to help Bunyan and spoke very highly of what he had to say, but he also said that regarding others too. He had a book, I think it was Joseph Allen's Sure Guide to Heaven, and said on one occasion, it's one of those anecdotal things, that there's more theology in this book than in all of my writings. And that was a very gracious thing to say, because if you read the book, it's clearly not the case, But Owen saw the value of what he wrote and highly appreciated him, and he was a very humble man. I think the Puritans were very humble and didn't. There were some, though, that insisted on these divisions, but there were others who lamented them. Yes.
The book I read about, does that talk about brethren of different persuasions living together in a congregation, so to speak, or is it more of
It is his work on how to heal those divisions. It's his plea to try to get them to change and to work together. I haven't read the whole book, so I couldn't tell you everything that is in it, but that would be the book to look at to see what he thought about it and what should be done and the limits of how far he thought it should extend. Yeah. Brian? Oh, not who were they, but who are they? They still exist today. Paedo-Baptists are those who believe that infants ought to be baptized. And as opposed to Baptists who believe that only professing adults or those that are of age who understand the gospel should be baptized. And we'll actually get into that in the new members class when we get into the sacraments. Yeah. Donna?
Just another comment that came up this morning when we were talking in Sunday school about the marks of the church. We talked about the idea of issue-driven churches, how that would be so contrary to what Burroughs would be desiring. That if you can't follow or agree with me in this issue, so to speak, then you can't be part of that.
Right. In that case, you don't necessarily have a doctrine that's dividing you, but you have perhaps an application of the moral law that's dividing you when you say that this point needs to be preeminent with you, and if you're not as interested in this as I am, then I can't have fellowship with you. But yeah, he would be opposed to that, as well as doctrinal divisions and church government divisions, which also amount to doctrinal divisions. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? If everybody saw it our way? We would still have certain boundaries that we wouldn't want, to be crossed, but we would have a great deal more unity. But it's not in our hands, just as it wasn't in Burroughs and Marshall and Usher and Baxter. We can only do what we can do to try to bring brethren together. But I think it's a barrier that obviously Christians need to learn to cross. The problem is when you first come into a particular view and you're all gung-ho for it, you tend to just really look down on others who don't agree with you on those things. And it's not until you get past all of that and you get settled in what you believe and you begin to see what's really on the heart of the Lord, which isn't that, right doctrine is very important, of course, but what about these passages of Scripture that talk about preserving the bond of unity and the spirit of peace and the love of the Spirit and so forth? That doesn't just apply to local congregations, but applies to the church as a whole. And we need to take that seriously and not continue to be the cause of that division, but try to be the cause of healing. And again, I think the direction that we go with the different doctrines that we hold to, some just push it in a particular direction that makes it more abrasive to the other people or brings out the differences rather than the commonality and so forth, and can make matters worse because, for whatever reason, you can't I can't think of a good reason for doing that. You know, you should try to bring out what you have in common rather than what separates you. And when you do talk about what separates you, to do it humbly and openly, and in a way that you're open to talk about it, but also open to receive correction and maybe discussion. It's hard to find two Christians that can talk about a subject they disagree on, that don't just get angry with one another and don't want to talk about it. We should be able to talk about those things and try to reason through them and see if there is a way to come to an agreement without getting angry about it. So, Greg?
I think a lot of divisions are perpetuated as well because there is never that kind of communication. And each side in a controversy has a kind of caricature of what the other side is like and the things they believe, and they set up a straw man that they can easily attack from their perspective, and that makes them feel comfortable. And so the divisions persist.
Yeah, that happens too. That happens quite frequently. Thankfully, there are those on the other side of an issue that will correctly represent their opposing party's view because they've actually taken the time to find out what it is. But very often they just build a caricature of that view, which isn't correct, and then tear it down and expect that somehow that's going to be helpful, but doesn't really obviously help anyone. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, I don't see any. Let's then turn in our hymnals to hymn number 457.